أرسمك أرسم أمل بسام ونرسم حضارة ومدن وبرك حمام وأمان لو جيت في.
Welcome to your weekly program, the show that brings the other side of Arab American to your living room. A lot been talking about religious clothes, religious dress, code, Islamic dress. Now it's under assault from Europe, France, New Zealand, all places. First Muslim American, one Mrs. USA, just for sheer fact, she took her hijab off or whatever she gave her the prize for. But we're talking about the dress and identity, dress and religion. We have Dr. Fatma Reda. She has a philosophy in Islamic jurisprudence in al-fiqh, and she also MD in psychiatric, and she's been active in the community here. And we're going to talk about clothes and dress and identity and why. Welcome to BelAhdan first.
Thank you very much.
I want to, Muslim women been wearing the hijab for years, hundreds of years. Why is it now that is taking that major space in American psych and American media? Why people start focusing on what the Muslim women are dressing or not dressing?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد. Muslim women have been and have not been wearing what we technically call the Muslim dress for hundreds of years. Actually, covering the hair, let's say, antedates Islam. It was there before Islam, and at that point it did not have a religious significance per se, but it had a socioeconomic significance. Women who did not cover their hair were either low status or were of very poor reputation, ill repute. So in other words, decent women from good families, etc., did cover their hair. So it was a sort of status, and it wasn't just confined to the Muslim or the Arab community even before Islam. It was, in Greece and in Europe and everywhere, and different kinds of headdress and what have you. Also, it wasn't just the women. Men also had different kinds of, right? So we have to make a demarcation historically between what was customs, etc., and then what until now has religious connotation. It came with the Quranic revelation, obviously, that emphasized more than emphasizing any particular parts of the body that had to, although it did that also, it emphasized modesty. And it was both for men and women. And that's another thing that gets forgotten, is that men also, Muslim men also, are required to dress in a modest way.
And Saudi's men and some of Bedouin, they wear a sign of hijab too. They put
right, and it isn't just the headdress, it's the entire body. The whole idea is that what the sociologists and biologists call secondary sexual characteristics, the things that start appearing with at the age of puberty in both males and females, and are therefore an indication that this person is ready for sexual activity, let's say, and are an attraction,
on that age?
then that needs to be covered. Why? Because that is for private use, not for public display. Okay, and the emphasis again, I will say, in Islam is on modesty, meaning do not appear. You can even, and the examples are very well known. We know what you refer to as hijabi women in Egypt.
I know,
okay?
you're gonna
I didn't
bring
like that very much, Ahmed, but you're still my friend. The hijabi women who, meaning they have their hair covered and yet they are in very tight clothes, or they are not moving in a very modest way, etc., etc. So it's not just, but then the Quran made it very clear what needs to be covered. There is not a universal consensus on what all needs to be covered, except for, because there are only 2 places in the Quran that indicate what needs to be covered in a woman's. The one thing that no one has any question about is the cleavage. Because it said, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, which means
that's mentioned.
That is mentioned. That is mentioned, and it's mentioned because if you study it historically, you find that in Arab society, in pagan Arab society, pre-Islamic, women were sold and bought on the street, and their prices depended on the size of their breasts.
Really?
Right. And so the larger,
almost
the
like
higher.
now.
Well, exactly. The culture hasn't changed very much. And so obviously, because that is a source of sexual attraction, then it makes sense that it should be covered.
But it's still culture, you know.
Well, no, but no, we moved from
imposing by men.
That was, however, when the Quran comes and says, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, which means that they have to cover with their khimar, they have to cover their cleavage. That's not men anymore. That's Allah Azza wa Jal. And then we have to follow. The Quran is the part of Islamic teaching that is totally incontrovertible. The hadith, and let me just mention very quickly here where generally speaking we get, you mentioned about my studies of Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh. In fiqh, there are 5 sources of lawmaking or legislation. The first and most important one is the Quran, which is the revelation of Allah Azza wa Jalla. Muhammad is not its author. Muhammad is a medium through which the Quran came, through the agency of the Archangel Gabriel. That's incontrovertible. It exists today and will exist until eternity exactly the way it was revealed. And whatever is mentioned there is no argument about.
But the interpretation of it changes.
Yeah. Yes, but in the Quran there are even the Quran itself tells you that there are ayat muhkamat, which they are tight, very tight and very clear cut. When it says وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, it means cover your cleavage. There is no other interpretation for it.
That could shut down a lot of industry in this country.
Well, that's
economy might collapse.
That's a different story. But then there are other ayat mutashabihat, means that it leaves room for interpretation in which ijtihad comes in. And I think the genius of Islam has always been in its scientists, including religious scientists, being willing to do ijtihad. When we close ijtihad and become very rigid, then pretty soon it starts dwindling, because then it will not meet the needs of one generation after the other. So that's the first thing. The second source is the hadith. And the hadith, we have to go after the authenticated hadith. And there is an entire science and how do we, and the matan and the isnad, etc., because as you and I and every Muslim knows, there are all kinds of hadith that are attributed to Sayyidina Muhammad that he never said. And then after that, the consensus of the scholars. The consensus of the scholars is where we are stuck as Muslims right now. Why? Because the scholars of Indonesia may be interpreting things differently than the scholars of Los Angeles. You see?
Of the hijab.
As it should. Of everything.
But let's focus on hijab. How is it different in Indonesia and Saudi Arabia? How is it different in a Muslim living in a non-Muslim country? And how it's been used since 9/11?
Okay. As you very well know, there are even Muslim countries that banned hijab, okay, in different places. Tunisia was one, Turkey was one, all right? And Tunisia is not a secular state, okay, but nor is it a religious state in the sense of a theocracy such as Iran. And then again, we have the Saudi Arabia, which is the other side of the continuum. If we talk about the reality of what hijab represents right now, it's much more than a Muslim woman's choice, which actually that's the most important part of it, is that this is how I display my submission. One of the ways in which I display my submission to the will of my God. Okay, this is one of the ways that I choose as a Muslim woman to do that.
You were not wearing